Welcome to the final chapter before the test, and we're going to look at chapter 4, supply chain strategies. But first, let's have a bit of a recap. In week 1, we were introduced to the concepts of supply chain, what it is, what it looks like, information flows. Second week was globalization, so the context in which our business is working in, and it was a competitive environment where we could look all around the world to build our supply chain. And then last week we started to look at offshoring and outsourcing, so deciding whether we should own the factors of production in another country or we should just simply work with independent companies. So this week we're actually going to look at the production facility and start to have a look in the factory to see how they make the garments and what's the most effective or efficient way to make garments. Okay, so let's start with an overview of the corporation. And up the top here we have the corporate strategy, which might be a 5-year plan as to where the company sees itself going, whether it's an expansionist strategy or they want to just maintain market share or perhaps divest and move into other areas. Whatever strategy they choose, they need to communicate that directly with the logistics and supply chain management team, and who create a strategy around that, because it's no point having a corporate strategy which says we want to increase the number of stores worldwide and then not tell the logistics people. So if we take a company like Cotton On, which is expanding into China as a retail operator, they'd have to develop their strategy in line with this logistics supply chain strategy. Off that, between the relationship between these two departments is you have your individual business unit. So there could be the manufacturing unit for Cotton On and the retail department of Cotton On would then have to start deciding where to put the stores, how many stores to have, etc. And then we can further break that down into, say, the Shanghai strategy, Beijing and Guangzhou. So the main point is the corporate strategy and the logistics strategy are directly linked to each other to ensure that the goals can be achieved. So if we have a look at manufacturing now, we'll see that there's a lengthy journey. It started traditionally as craft orientated and moved along into mass production, lean production and mass customization. So we'll look at these in a bit more detail. Main thing to note on our little chart here is output volume from 0 to X, meaning the number of garments being produced, and here is the variety. So when you had craft production, you had quite a low volume because it was handmade, but you had a large variety. So each tailor was making the garments slightly different. Then we moved into mass production where we have low variety but a great volume of garments being made. And as we move into mass customization, we kind of get back to this position of craft production, however at higher volumes. But we'll look at these one by one and see how they'll make a bit more sense. Okay, so there's 4 production strategies you're going to have to remember for the test: craft, mass, lean and mass customization. Starting with craft, it is customer specific, unique to each product, has a variable quality and is expensive, also known as, I'll just put this in, bespoke. Or tailor-made in our case. So if you're going for high-end garments, you could go that way. It's not the preferred method anymore because of the costs associated with it, so it's kind of for the high end or for the home market. So as we said before, if we go back to our little chart here, craft production meant wide variety but low volume. So that's our first method of production. So as a corporate strategy, we have to make a decision whether we want to go for a craft production process. Next one is mass production, and this one you're probably more common with. It evolved from England during the Industrial Revolution about 200 years ago, and they worked out a much more efficient way to make clothes. And what they did was to divide the tasks. So if you're going to make a garment, you divide it up into its components. So sewing on the sleeves, putting the collar on, the trims, such as the buttons, etc. And when you divide the process, you can allocate an individual worker to each process. So we'll get one of these workers here whose job it will be just to sew on sleeves all day. The advantage of this is they get good at it because it's the only thing they have to do, and they can produce more. So you end up with this kind of assembly line process, such as in the image here, and you get a low variety when it comes to types of garments. So basically, you set up the factory for a production run of 100,000 units or 50,000 units with no variation, just the same garment over and over and over again. The advantage of this is cost. You get costs down. So when we're talking about a Kmart, they're going for mass production. They go to a country which has low labour costs, such as Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, China to a lesser extent, and they produce on this scale. Interesting point to note, it was basically this method that allowed the world to have an abundance in material products. And so if you look at the amount of products available in the last 200 years, it's increased exponentially because of this manufacturing process. But it's not enough anymore to just run your factory as a mass produced operation, because there's a lot more competition out there who are doing it just as well as you. So the manufacturing process had to evolve into a lean manufacturing operation. And this, as we'll see soon, came out of Japan. But as it says here, lean's the elimination of anything not absolutely required to deliver a quality product or service to our customers. So fundamentally, you take the mass production system, you look at the factory, and you start saying, how can we make it more efficient? So it's an evolution of mass production. And we get rid of all the wastes from the system. So staff members who aren't doing anything, or are working too slowly, or are spending too much time making a garment, gets removed from the process. Pull based, and we'll look at this a bit later, but basically means you don't make a garment until there is demand for it. So it's what a modern supply chain is working on. And even production runs with neither idle time nor surges in demand, and just-in-time inventory management. So again, basically saying we should be busy from Monday to Friday. If we're operating a factory which is busy Monday and Tuesday, and there's not much work Wednesday, then we start to become inefficient and wasteful. So even consistent production is kind of what we're going for. So if we were factory managers and we were inside our factory, we'd be looking for these key wastes, also known in Japanese as muda. So this came out of Toyota in the 1960s, 70s, and also known as, or part of the Toyota production system. So let's look at them in more detail, starting with overproduction. Okay, part 2. So we're looking at production, the key wastes. So we're managers, we're in a factory, and the first thing we ask ourselves, are we producing too many garments? Obvious reason is that if you're making too many and they don't sell, we're going to have to put them on sale, reducing our margins, taking up space in the retail store, and also cannibalizing our new range, which is out as well. So we adopt a system, according to the Japanese, called just in time. if we believe that customers are going to buy 100 garments, then we make 100, not 101 or 105 or 107, but exactly what they want. This means we don't overproduce. What's happened in the past is because companies aren't efficient, they know they're only going to sell 100, but they're not confident in their systems and their capabilities. They'll produce 110, and they'll say, oh, just in case we make a mistake on one or two of them. The Japanese say you shouldn't be making mistakes. So they introduce concepts like poka-yoke, where is it? Which is Japanese for mistake proofing, and you'll see in the toots, we'll run through this, a YouTube clip on how they actually do that. Process capability is another thing they look at, is to make sure that the machines are capable of producing the garments required, and that you don't have too many machines as well. Because there's a tendency when you've got too many sewing machines or that you tend to overuse it, or there's a need to feel like you have to use the machine, and so you make extra garments. And finally, SPC, or statistical process control, is using computer software systems to monitor production in the factory and just to pick up any problems that may occur on the way. The second point that Japanese say we should look at in our factory is waiting. If you've got, and this is a product that's waiting, so if you've got a garment sitting on a rack in a warehouse, you start asking yourself, well, how long should it have to sit there? So if it's there for a week or 2 weeks, then they would say, well, that's inefficient. We need to be much leaner. So we set a benchmark and say, okay, it's 2 weeks in the waiting now. Let's aim for 1 week next month or with the next batch, and then keep cutting that down. Now that can go for a garment or a piece of fabric in the production line, or a truck sitting in traffic. It's all part of waiting, although we'll see on the next one in transport how it's more specific for that. One solution is the SMED, single minute exchange of dies. This is more in sort of mass production like factories or industrial processes. This is where if you need to change a component on a machine, so let's say you've got a press which presses out a door for a car, and you want to use that press to press another part of the car out, you need to change the die on it. So if you can make that process more efficient, kind of like changing the needle in a sewing machine, if you can do that quicker, then you reduce the waiting time. Thirdly is transportation. So excessive movement and handling may cause damage to the garment and is an opportunity for quality to deteriorate. Okay, in terms of transport, if we've got, here's our campus here, let's say we were making the garment here, but we were cutting the fabric, where can we cut it? Let's cut it in Nicholson Street, in another facility. So the cut fabric would then have to travel along Glen Lyon Road to this campus where it would be sewn. The Japanese would then start to say, well, what value is there in having these two processes in different parts of the suburb? So if we can minimise that transport movement, so bring them closer together, that again is going to improve our efficiency. So there's no value adding that occurs from the consumer's perspective. The customer's not going to know that you cut the fabric in Nicholson Street, so it doesn't add any value to it. The solution then is to go from a linear to a cellular layout, and again we'll look at this in the tubes, but basically it means rather than running our systems, where are we? What we might do is if this is our central manufacturing position, then we kind of start building facilities around here so that you've got flows going in these directions rather than up and down like that. Inventory, this is the big one that we should all be familiar with, and particularly if you work in retail, you'll know that to have stock at the back of the store is not very useful. stock is only useful when it's on display, available for the customer to see, touch, feel, and ultimately buy. So keep inventory to a minimum, and we can start to divide inventory or classify it according to where it is in the supply chain. So we've got the raw materials such as the cotton. That's one form of inventory, or inventory in one form. WIP, or work in process. This is garments that are being assembled. So that's a work in process or pipeline inventory. And finished garments. We can have inventory, as I said, at the back of the retail store. Some of the solutions we can look for is identify the root cause of the problem. That should be, why is there so much cotton sitting in a warehouse, or why are there so many garments at the back of the store? And let's adopt a just-in-time system. So let's order just enough raw cotton to satisfy the spinning mills. Let's order just enough fabric to satisfy the factory, etc. But all the time we're seeking to minimize it and making sure we don't, we're not short, so we end up having an unhappy customer. Next one is inappropriate or over processing. The best analogy I use for this is, sometimes, have you ever done an assignment where you spend a disproportionate amount of time? It might be an unpleasant assignment, and you tend to spend a disproportionate amount of time working on the cover, on the artistic cover of it, rather than the content, because you like to do that. So that's the amount of effort you put into the cover doesn't add value to the report itself. So in our factory, we're looking at our workers as they make the garments, and we have to ask ourselves, how much time, or how well are they sewing that collar on? Does it need to be sewn on that well? So there's degrees of quality, if you like, and the quality of the garment has to be in line with the value for that garment. So obviously a $5 t-shirt, it doesn't have to have the same quality of sewing or the same time spent sewing than a $100 t-shirt, for instance. So the solution to that is what we call needs analysis to match capabilities to requirements. So understand your garment, understand your market, and then put in the appropriate effort, and not too much, nor obviously too little. Excess motion and movement. Now this is motion and movement within the factory. So what we do as managers is we get a little map of our factory, our assembly area, and we start asking questions about, well, where's the sewing machine? Where's the cutting table? Are they close to each other? If not, why not? Why do we have to walk the fabric, the cut fabric, from one end to the factory to the other? Let's bring them closer together. Why is the receiving area where the truck arrives should be right next to the press area where the garments are finally pressed for shipment? So there's a whole science behind allocating space within a production facility. Now, again, next time you go to McDonald's, have a look at where they've got their microwaves and their cash registers and the fryers for the chips. They're all strategically located to minimize excess motion and movement, which again adds cost but not value to the product. And a big no-no, according to the Japanese, is rework. They absolutely don't like the idea of reworking a product. If you have to make a garment and then at the end of the construction of that garment you realize that a button is missing, for instance, the costs associated with pushing that garment back through the factory to get it back to the right worker to put the button on is prohibitive. So they say, don't make mistakes. Make it right the first time. And if you do make mistakes, like there is a button missing, find out why. Why did it go missing? And then perhaps we need to develop a mistake proofing concept like Poka-yoke that we looked at in overproduction briefly, so that we don't get buttonless garments. And the philosophy of sort of making sure there's no mistakes is TQM, Total Quality Management. And again, we'll look at that in more detail later on. Final one, and this is a relatively new concept. So it's not part of the original ones we just looked at, wastes, and that is not utilising employees' talents. So often you'll find in organisations is that you have people with certain capabilities and certain skills, but they're doing jobs which is perhaps a bit below their what they are capable of. So a good organisation can identify their staff, can identify the skills, what motivates their staff, and then give them jobs according to that. Very different to the traditional mass production model. Remember we looked at that earlier on, where basically, you know, they don't care. They just stick you on a sewing machine and tell you to sew, regardless of how good or bad you are. In a lean manufacturing process, they say no, people make a difference. So if you want to get the most out of people, you've got to motivate them by giving them challenging and interesting jobs to do. Otherwise, they fall asleep. Okay, that's the end of part 2. There's one more video to come to finish off the last, what do we got? 6 slides.